Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Simon spoke with American magazine writer May Jeong.
May spoke about her decision to go to Afghanistan just after she'd finished university, about why she was motivated to go and cover conflict and then to stop covering conflict, and also about her latest moves as she tries to write some fiction.
Enjoy.
So hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. This is a slightly different episode in that it's being recorded live in front of a modest audience at Stirpo, which is a villa in Italy where I have had the great pleasure of co-hosting a writer's retreat this week with an Italian art historian called Gianni Dubini. And very excitingly, one of the guests here, May Jeong, has consented to be a guest on the podcast. May, great to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
You're most welcome. Can we go straight in with how you got to Afghanistan? We're going to be talking about some of your reporting from there on the episode, but how you, while still in your kind of early to mid-20s, right, ended up in Kabul. How did that come to pass?
It was a long process of elimination, really. I graduated after the financial crisis and could not get a job that I wanted to, and it was made pretty clear to me that the aspirational goals that I'd had when I was younger, growing up, reading newspapers, in my teenage years in high school, those jobs were very quickly disappearing. And back then the goal was still to become a foreign correspondent. And if I wanted to do that, the best way really would be to just figure it out on my own. So I flew out, and what's been so curious to me is these categories that you people put you into. And so the fact of my being in Kabul made me an expat, but effectively, I was an economic migrant as well. I was looking for jobs, and so then that's the motivating force that got me to Kabul.
I'm going to push you on that though a bit. Because,
Please do.
There are other places you can go to get work than Kabul. Can we roll back a bit? So you'd grown up in Canada, and you'd done your university studies there and so forth.
Correct.
But how, did you know people in Afghanistan? Did you have a connection? What was the... I'm going to dive into this a little bit.
No, go for it. Why?
Did you want to cover conflict?
I think it's embarrassing to say, but probably yes. I had a vague idea of wanting to do things that was far away. I remember a close friend of mine who I'm about to go visit in London. We were talking one day, and we were talking about how we sort of collectively arrived at the conclusion that jealousy is actually a really wonderful thing. When you feel it, it tells you what you actually want. And I'd noticed that, and she detected it as well, that people that I felt envious towards were people who were just living abroad. It was a very broad category. So I knew that. And so then in turn, that got me out of Canada, working in Beirut, which is where I first went to do an internship at the Daily Star, the English language newspaper there. And I thought that this was this sort of incredible feat on my part. I'd sort of discovered that this is a thing you could do. And then, of course, retroactively, I'd since learned that many people have done it. It's not original in any way. And and Afghanistan sort of made sense because I think I was mentioning this to other people here, I started reading the newspaper and really sort of becoming engaged with what was happening in the wider world around the time when 9/11 happened, and that in turn meant I was reading certain books, which then sort of dictated what kind of programs I applied for in college, which then determined what kind of professors I had, which then led to certain internships and other interests. And so it's arbitrary. It seems.
I think the reason I'd push is I know lots of people who went abroad as reporters. I did it myself.
Yeah.
But relatively few, who went to Afghanistan.
I think it was a superlative thing.
Higher.
It was what's the most extreme thing I can do? I grew up. I think this is the case with most people who sort of throw themselves into such situations. I think you sort of grew up reasonably comfortable, and you're trying to offset that in some ways by traveling the furthest distance, going to the place that is the most far, and I think that those were my impulses. But also, I have to add, another thing that we've been talking about this week is that it's very easy to articulate why you do simple things, like why did you turn left on this road, not right, or why did you order whatever, chicken, not pork. But I think with big decisions, sometimes it's really hard to articulate why you do things. Like, why do you fall in love with certain people? Why do you choose to devote the next 5 years of your life working on a PhD dissertation? These are things that are hard to quantify.
So when did you arrive in Afghanistan?
First week January 2013.
Okay, and so we're going to talk about this Guardian long read that you did about the fortune tellers, which I thought was really wonderful. But so that's like 2 years into your time there.
Correct.
So how did the process of kind of finding your feet professionally and journalistically, but also just in learning how to operate in that environment, in that, maybe if we talk through that 2 year period, how did that work?
I spent the first 6 months, I would say, reading all the things. I read up to that point, I'd read every single book that had ever been published on Afghanistan. And that came from a place of real insecurity. I felt like I didn't know anything.
How old were you?
Say anything? 24, 25. Okay. I turned 25 there, I think. So yeah, I knew nothing. So then I was sort of trying to amass knowledge desperately. And I had a similar thing that we talked about earlier, which is the sense of not starting the thing you're meant to start because you want to arrive at a place that you feel comfortable with. But of course, you're never comfortable doing a new thing. And so yeah, that's what happened. And I think 2014, if I recall, that's when the elections were. September 2013, into the new year is when the elections were happening. And the elections we thought was going to be a quick and easy affair. And of course, it dragged out for many, many months. And I was covering the elections for The Guardian, so I was doing daily news, waking up every day. I think they had this exercise where they made me, I think I had to pitch a story a day, which is just
How would you got in touch with The Guardian initially for that?
Expat community is really small, and so I think honestly the first sort of in was the actual Guardian correspondent was going on holiday and she needed someone to cover for her.
Okay.
So I did that, and then I think eventually she left, and then I sort of inherited that gig along with like lawn furniture that she was trying to get rid of.
So when you arrived, you had clips from your experience in Beirut. Did you have other like professionally published stuff?
No, I had nothing. One good thing that I had done was that I'd worked at Reuters, and that taught me that I don't want to work in a newswire. And then
Where were you doing that?
Toronto, Toronto,
okay.
during school, and then I worked for our national newspaper, the Globe and Mail. That intern taught me that
these were internships, or these were longer?
Traineeships, internships, so really, really basic sort of entry level positions. And so then working at the newspaper taught me I don't want to work at a newspaper. And then actually this wonderful woman who, Sarah Fulford, who was the editor-in-chief of a little-known magazine, very influential in Toronto, called Toronto Life, which is the New York Magazine equivalent of in Canada. And she had given me a lead, which I had then followed, which was a story about a gang rape scandal that happened in an immigrant community in Canada. And I had worked on that story for a year. And so by the time I got to Afghanistan, I'd already had that experience. And
had that run?
It had run, and it was actually nominated for the Canadian National Magazine Award.
So it sounds to me like actually you had a kind of fair level of experience before you went.
It seems that way on paper, but really I had no idea what I was doing. And but I did know that I had this vague idea that what I wanted was to do magazine stories because I think it suited my temperament better. And so all throughout I knew that's where I wanted to arrive eventually.
And how did you go about kind of learning to operate in Afghanistan? Learning to keep yourself safe and things like that.
Like so much of it was osmosis, just learning from, like going to dinner parties and because there are no real restaurants, you're eating at people's houses every day, and then you're hosting as well. So it's a real communal space, and these same people you're going to, embassy receptions with, and then you have yoga together and then brunch. And so it's a real sort of summer camp feel. And the friends I've made in that time, it's almost like dog years. I mean, they become quite good friends, and I just kept. I was just learning all throughout whatever it is that people were saying, or books that were being recommended, or what have you.
And were the kind of more older members of the press corps, were they welcoming in general?
It's funny, I haven't quite spoken publicly about this quite yet because I'm still formulating how I feel about it, but I think there was an element of, young writer-shaped thing, so sweet. And then I think once I
started publishing big things.
And then I think some people maybe felt that they didn't quite know how to engage with me because we had a certain dynamic, and that dynamic had been interrupted, and it was unclear how it might go after.
Okay. And we always, with everyone on the podcast, try and speak about money. How did it work, in these early years in Afghanistan? Were you able to, because obviously these conflict cities can be very expensive as well. Were you able to support yourself?
No, I made no money. I think, if I recall, I made less than like $10,000 the first year.
Did that cover your costs?
No, but I had savings because I'd had jobs
okay.
in Canada. And the great thing about a Canadian education is that you go to school practically for free. So I didn't have student debt. And I hadn't really realized how much of a blessing that is until I'd met my American friends who are saddled with debt, and I didn't have that. So I had some room to maneuver.
And your decision to go there, how was it perceived by your friends, by your family, by people close to you?
I think my parents were quite devastated. They would so funny. My mother still she tells me she didn't sleep a wink the whole time that I was there, which might be hyperbolic on her part. And then my friends, I remember when I was trying to decide. We'd all read this book called Behind the Beautiful Forever by Catherine Bu, which is a great book about India, Bombay, that I highly recommend if anyone is interested in good writing or India or poverty. And the book reads as if it were a novel, and then the author's note, she talks about how, because she has an illness, a physical condition, and she was trying to decide, should I devote the next 3 years of my life working on this project, living in the slums? Am I suited for this? And while she's debating, one night she gets up in the middle of the night to go get a glass of water, and she trips and falls. There's a thesaurus on the floor. She trips over the thesaurus and breaks her ribs, I think. And the lesson in this for her was that you can die doing anything. Mm-hmm. And I think perversely that sort of was a kind of a guiding star for me. You can die doing anything. Do you think
that's true? I mean, it obviously is true, but there are some things that are more dangerous than others.
I think it's easier to do things when you don't know better.
Right.
I think I went because I truly didn't know better. And I think I stayed for so long because I went pretty much after school, and I think I conflated like a war zone living with being an adult, and I thought, oh, this is just being an adult now. And now I'm realizing, no, there are certain luxuries you can enjoy, like
were there, because I know in say Nairobi or Cairo there will be lots of young people relatively fresh out of college hoping to become journalists. Were there others like that in Afghanistan? Or
yes, but the massive advantage of Afghanistan is that it's just harder enough that there weren't that many. Yeah. And I think that was the calculus that I had made in my head.
Sure. And can we talk then about this interest in writing, magazine journalism, narrative nonfiction, however we would call it? Did you mentioned earlier that was a kind of reflection of your temperament? Did you think, or was it and you always to mention this negative thing? You didn't want to work for a newspaper, you didn't want to work for a wire. How were there kind of positive things pulling you towards it as well?
Positive thing towards magazine. Yeah. Yes, I'm the
financially buoyant state of the magazine industry.
Sure, well that's the other thing. No, but honestly, like if you write for The Guardian, I think at the time, if I recall, they could pay you as low as 300 or 400 and maybe 500 pounds per article. Yeah. And so it doesn't make any sense for you to work days working on a story that could net you 300 pounds versus working on something for many weeks or months or in one financially ruinous occasion years, and then you get paid thousands. Yeah. That just makes basics. I mean, I'm not that good at math, but that seemed pretty obvious to me. As well, I have like writerly ambitions. I love reading fiction, and I aspire to write it one day. And so magazine reporting is actually a really happy sort of blend of investigative work, which I quite like. I do have a part of me that is very monomaniacal, and then writing is important, so it sort of made sense.
So that all does indeed make sense. Can we talk through this Guardian piece, like in terms of from idea to pitching to the reporting process? How had you this was a long read. We'll put it in the show notes. But so for the shop in London, which was run at the time by Shannon, presumably by Jonathan Shannon, who we've had on the show.
He's wonderful.
He's our second most popular guest ever. After he was for a while our first, but he was usurped. How did you go about conceiving this idea, and then had you written at magazine scale before that story?
Which story? The fortune teller story?
Yeah, the fortune teller.
No, I'd written one story for this Toronto Life magazine.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Sure. So how did this piece go about from conception to execution?
I've always been interested in belief systems, and inadvertently what it ended up doing was using the story of the fortune teller to talk about the war, but actually, as a friend of mine, another great writer, Anand Gopal, whose book on Afghanistan everyone should read, he sort of accurately pointed out that while the article is about the war, it actually does not mention the conflict, and
I don't think it doesn't. I mean, it's there.
It's like ambient background noise, but
and there's the bombing or the attack
yes,
at the end.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. But it's not very explicitly, pardon me, about the war. And I think it came from a place of wanting to tell stories that weren't just about like death and destruction or like Afghans. They're just like us. I mean, there was an evening one time after dinner, a few reporters, we sat down and just wrote down like prototypes of articles I've written about Afghanistan. There's maybe like 8 or 10.
Right.
It's all this last Jew of Kabul. There's a list. Yeah. And I think my ambition maybe was to try to sort of do something a little different.
And had you had kind of pre-existing interaction with this guy before you wrote about him?
Yes. If I recall, he was quite popular among interpreters who had previously worked with the American military, who had then applied for these things called special immigrant visas to go to America, and he became very well known because
he had this like whole network.
Yeah. So it was sort of a friend of a friend of a friend kind of thing.
And what about the process of pitching it then? How did that work?
At The Guardian?
Yeah. Had you met Jonathan, for example, at this time?
This was a very peculiar, atypical situation because Jonathan was actually in my larger friend circle in London. Friends from back home in Canada. Right. And so that definitely helped. I don't think I knew him before they got to know him.
And was this quite early in the kind of life cycle?
I think he was one of the first stories they ran, after he became the long reads editor,
So how did you pitch it, in person or?
Gosh, such a terrible memory. I think I must have sent an email pitch and then I never heard back from him ever again. Okay. And then I was passing through London one time, and then I think he took me out for a drink or a coffee or something. Okay. And then we talked it through. Okay. And then he in turn deputized his deputy editor, David, who is
he's my editor then,
much more responsive on email. And that's how it happened.
I don't think Jonathan's replied to an email since
I can't even talk about this issue because I think it's just there's no answer. There's no Can
we talk about editors not answering emails?
Oh yes. Not answering emails. So I think
they do get a lot of mail, we should say.
They do. And so I try to be understanding because they're all of them are working under duress. I think it does help when you know them. Yeah. when you're not like a disembodied email in an inbox, but a real person. And I think that's why it's so important to cultivate real personal relationships with these people.
Okay. And so then was there like a moment where you'd known this fortune teller and you kind of had to then declare that you were writing about him? How did you let him know what was going on?
Oh, from right away. You introduced yourself as a reporter.
But you'd met him before you were...
Yes, but it was always in a professional capacity. Sure. And I think, if one thing that is, I think, confounding to people is why do we have to sit down for the 37th time? That is confusing to people. Yeah. But I think at some point, I'd gone over so many times that it didn't even register for him. And that's of course where you want to, that's
Sure.
the place you want to arrive at, right?
I mean, I was interested in reading it, that it was written, you know, it's interesting because I've been doing this edit this week, an edit for another magazine where the line has been like more quotes, more vocab, more, you know, speech. And, you know, it was very light on speech. I mean, the prose was beautiful, but it was narrative. And then later on, there was a little bit of dialogue that swept in. Were they kind of happy for you to take that quite narrative-driven, quite almost essay-like approach with it?
Yes, I think earlier versions did have quotes, and then in the smoothing out process,
okay,
it be narrativized.
Yeah.
Is that a word? Yeah,
I think it's a word.
Certain sections.
Yeah. And what was the edit like?
Gosh.
Compared to edits before and since? You know?
Sure.
And again, this is with the broader context that, you know, obviously huge transatlantic differences in editing style, although the long read does tend to edit in quite an American sense and so forth.
I mean, again, this was many years ago, so memory's not quite intact and clear in my head, but I do remember being very impressed that Jonathan would read the draft, and then he had sort of like 3 or 4 points that were...
Jonathan or David?
Shannon.
Okay.
Yeah. He would have these like meta points that were actually really helpful for me in like reconceptualizing certain parts of the story, because you know, I mean, this is the editor's job. You're sort of knee deep in whatever it is that you're knee deep in, and this sort of voice of reason is speaking to you from like up atop the rabbit hole, telling you what's important and what's not. And I remember him being very good about that.
And then in terms of, you know, when it ran, did you feel, again, this is a question I always find interesting with magazine writers, like, did you feel it kind of landed? Did it make impact? Did people read it? Were people talking about it? Or did it vanish into a black hole?
I've definitely had articles that sort of, they're like pebbles that sink to the bottom of the river. And this story, I do remember it doing well. I'm using air quotes. People who...
Traffic.
No, I don't even know if it was traffic is about a fortune teller in Afghanistan, but people I respected appreciated it, and that was meaningful to me.
Did it feel like a kind of professional arrival in some ways?
It did, yeah, it did.
And could you tell us a bit about, you know, just the mechanics of operating, maybe through this and then through the Kunduz piece, which I wanted to talk about as well. You know, how much could you move around in Kabul? What were your methods of transport? You know, how could you vox pop people on the street? Like, what could you do, and what also could you not do in that environment?
I mean, a lot of things I could do, I can't do anymore. I think expats now live a much more abridged life than I used to, and I'm sure people from older generations would say the same. When I first arrived, you could walk around, and then I took yellow.
Did it help? I mean, that you are Asian?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes and no. Like anything, I am of East Asian descent. Therefore, I look like a Hazara.
Would you be thought to be a Hazara?
Yes.
Yeah.
If dressed a certain way, and if I had the habitus down right, it would help in you blend in, but also you don't want to look like a Hazara where in a region where Hazaras are being persecuted, which is like most of the country.
Yeah.
And so there were some additional dangers, I guess, associated with looking like a member of the persecuted tribe. And
in transport, how did that work?
I could walk the first year, and then I would take these yellow cabs.
Did you have one like particular driver, or? So
that's the thing. So then eventually I was forced to get a driver and be a bit more judicious about who I would, work with. And typically what happened was that when I was going into other provinces to work, my fixer would then hire like a trusted friend who also happened to have a car, and I would sort of, take his word for it and then go with them.
What about language? How did that work?
Well, a lot of places where you would go report are Pashtun areas. They speak Pashto, and I don't speak Pashto, and I don't know a lot of people who do. It's an impossible language to learn. Very difficult, I should say, not impossible. And even if you did, I think it would make sense to have someone who is a kind of a cultural broker when you're going, because it's really not even about the language. It's about, is this person the son of someone that we know?
Yeah.
And so even, for example, there was a gentleman that I would often work with who I talk to still quite often. He's from the south, and we were reporting in the east. It was of no use to me that he spoke Pashto, So then we would have to hire someone who's from the region.
And can we talk? No, actually, one thing before that. I mean, how, in terms of the amount of risk you were taking, how do you think it compared to what, say, the big staff reporters from AP or from Reuters were taking? And was it ever remarked upon? And now that, 5 or 6 years on, how do you feel about the kind of risks you were running?
I mean, that's the very thing. I don't think you do these things when you know what you're doing, really. I think at the time I thought I was making calculated risks. I'm using air quotes again. And so I did everything you could, but I could see how someone could go through that process and decide that it wasn't worth.
Did you have insurance?
Yeah, always.
Yeah. From who? From RSF?
It depended, RSF, and then when I think they've stopped offering that, and then I had somebody else, I forget who, but yeah.
And can we talk about the Kunduz piece? So again, we'll put it in the show notes of this investigation for the Intercept on the bombing of the MSF hospital. We kind of very impressive piece of investigative journalism. How did you kind of come to do that? And again, what was the process? Very different kind of story to the previous one. What was the process of reporting that like?
The how is quite simple. It happened, that story unfolded for me and for a lot of people in real time, right? I was in October 2013, I was in country, it happened, and I sort of
just after you'd arrived?
No, sorry, 14, I apologize.
Okay, right.
So then, so the strike happened, and I saw how the American military reacted to the event, which was subterfuge, which is predictable. And it was very clear to all of us that their sort of unofficial official approach to this blunder would be to wait it out until everyone forgot about the issue. And I was already on assignment for the Intercept to do another story about a drone strike, and when I was passing through New York that November, I mentioned this in passing to my editor, the great Roger Hodge, and he said, well, we should do the story.
Okay.
And so then that was it. And then I worked on it for, I think it was like 5 months or something, and it came out that the following April. And
what were your interactions with the military like? I mean, I saw you ended up having like a phone interview with like the top general, right? Who just possibly been cashiered.
Deeply unhappy.
Yeah, but he, they engaged eventually, or did it take...
I don't think he wanted to answer that phone call. I think that was a mistake on his part, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't think he wanted to talk to me.
And a lot of what the reporting sounds like is like, a kind of huge constellation of people, a lot of them talking off the record, a lot of... I mean, did you go to Kunduz? Were you able to do that?
Yes, many times.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, how did you ever at any point think like, this is not going to work, we're not going to be able to pull this together, or you're facing a lot of institutional...
It's tricky
resistance?
Because with these stories, like the Platonic ideal is very clear, right? The Platonic ideal is, they had this internal investigation report that had been redacted. I knew this copy existed.
Yeah.
I also knew that there were recordings of the pilots in the AC-130.
Who ended up being disciplined, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
So you have these two sort of you're trying to get there.
Yeah.
And so whatever you get, it will, you'll fall short. And I actually remember putting together the copy and then sending it to my editor and thinking, this is terrible. There's no way they're gonna run this.
I haven't stood it up enough.
Yeah. And then they were so pleased with it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, you kind of engage with the piece with this idea that the military and some of these, there's sort of two ideas. One that the Afghans present, which is like, we're trying to kill these people. It's absurd that once you go to a hospital, you can't. And that's obviously, that is attention assisted in all wars. But also this idea of like, even in a world of laser guided munitions and aircraft, the kind of chaos that is entailed by these things. And the idea that like, people do make mistakes and so forth. What do you think that there's... Do you think the culpability is in the kind of cover-up, or the culpability is in like the fact that this stuff happens, or is it something that's just always going to happen?
I think both. Of course, the cover-up, but also, which the military would argue otherwise, but also the fact that if you create a system where such mistakes are possible and quite easy to make, I feel like that carelessness veers into the realm of culpability.
Yeah.
Is
what was the reaction after the piece ran?
From
the the various constituencies, from the military, from...
I mean, I similar to you, I think a lot of people within the military or NATO, independently of their employers, congratulated me or the Intercept on the story. And then the U.S. military, I mean, I didn't hear from them, and then it subsequently became very difficult to engage with them.
Yeah, did you feel that there was with maybe some of the press a kind of transactional thing with the way the journalists were treated in terms of access, and then
Exactly. I mean, a lot of effectively what people do is they're stenographers for the military.
Yeah.
And I think it helped.
I'm struck by that sometimes.
Yeah, and I think it helped initially that I didn't have priors. I hadn't done much reporting on the military in that particular way, and so maybe they didn't really know what to make of me, and then in turn that yielded more access than it should have maybe.
And the experience of doing that for the Intercept, as opposed to like you've written for big legacy media, you've written for the New York Times Magazine and so forth, was that different? Was it distinct in terms of access or editing or finance in terms of how you were paid?
I mean, the Intercept is run on, as you know, OMIDR money, so that was a huge bonus for me. The funds were such that I could really report it the way I wanted to, and I'll always be grateful for that. And I think writing for the Intercept, there are many editors who work there, but the thing that was helpful for me was that this particular editor that I had, Roger, he had come from Harper's, and so he had a certain sensibility that spoke to me, and so it sort of made sense.
And how did it, you kind of you ascended the respective rungs of the magazine market, like at speed, right? You're kind of, you're riding at the very top of the game quickly. Again, had by this point the people who thought you were like a baby writer, were they now envious? Were they? I mean, how did that work out? I
mean, if they were envious, I don't think they would have told me. I don't know.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. What should I be saying?
Whatever you want, really. But I think your profession, you like advanced really rapidly. Did that feel that was like a commensurate payoff for the decisions you've made, or did you? I suppose like you're like 3 years in, it's going very well professionally. Did you feel like this is a place I want to be staying, or did you feel like this is fucking dangerous? Like I can do another year
in Afghanistan specifically. Yeah, I think I would have stayed had I not been forced to extricate myself for reasons that which is that I ended up going to this writing residency, which like physically forced me out of the country.
Which is where we met.
Yes, exactly. Great place. No, I think I would have stayed on for a very long time.
And do you think that would have been the right thing to do?
No, absolutely not. But I think I would have stayed on because I didn't know better. I didn't realize that you could. It sounds so sort of Pollyanna now, but I don't think it was within my like world to think that I could do anything else. It was like inconceivable to me.
And I wanted to talk about your kind of post-extraction from Afghanistan, post-Afghanistan life through the kind of lens of two pieces. So the first being the Kim Wall piece, which I actually read when it ran, so I didn't reread it today. And we should say, for those who don't know, this is a Danish reporter who was murdered, and who was a friend of yours, right? Who was murdered while reporting a story in Denmark And what was the experience of kind of bringing your professional chops as a reporter to a subject where you knew the subject, to someone where there was that emotional connection? Was that something you deliberately wanted to kind of write your way through this? Or?
Yeah, I mean, there's a great line in Patrick Radden Keefe. There's a story about I think Lockerbie bombing, and he interviews this person who I believe lost his brother in the bombing, and the character says something like, his character is a subject story as a reporter as well, and he launches an investigation into what happened, and he says that it was a way to sort of shirk his grieving duties, is how he calls it.
Okay.
And I think that's what it was for me as well.
Did it perform that duty?
You're just kicking the can down the road.
Okay, so you don't feel that you...
But it gave me something very practical to do in the moment.
And what did you come away... not find out, but what did you feel that you knew differently after you'd done that than before?
I mean, that's the funny thing about these like lessons, right? They're often quite banal. Like you do it, and then the lesson is that you can do it.
Right.
But I do remember after it ran, our common friend Tash, her asking me, or while I was doing it, or I forget when exactly the timeline was, but her asking, does this make you more weary of the world? Do you not want to be in the world anymore?
And did it?
And no, the answer is no, because I think in this particular case, he's such an anomaly. What happened
Right.
is that it's not something you can draw lessons from.
What do you think of the kind of gender aspect? Was this a risk that female reporters faced that male ones do not?
I don't think we're targeted because we are women in these
Right.
cases, but I think the danger is heightened, of course. I mean,
Yeah.
when you get into a car with, actually, this is a tricky thing to talk about, but
But a valid.
there's always like a danger that when I say yes to someone who's giving me access, that might end up in some form of violence. Absolutely.
Okay.
But I guess my reasoning was that I don't want it to be her legacy that I don't do certain things out of
Right.
fear.
Yeah.
That makes no sense to me. It's irrational.
Sure. Can we talk about the is it Fan Bing
Yes.
Bing piece? So I thought it was very interesting, and we'll talk maybe a bit more about your kind of gear shift out of Afghanistan in a way. But this is China's most famous actress who kind of vanishes off the map in a tax avoidance scandal. And I was interested how this came about. This is China. Had you reported from China before?
No.
And had you written for Vanity Fair before?
No.
So this was like and this is sort of showbiz, like it's a new direction, and I thought it was a great piece, and it had all the kind of rigor and also some of the like the writerly touches that were very apparent in the other work. I could see the line of continuation, but it was clearly a change of direction as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like how does it come about you're writing a movie story for Vanity Fair?
So after I moved back home, I had a meeting with Radhika
Home
Jones.
is Canada?
Sorry, New York.
So this is after we were living in the snow.
Yes,
in upstate New York.
post snow. I had a meeting actually right after the snow.
So yeah, we should explain that May and I met while we were living in some wood cabins in upstate New York in 2017, and we're now in another similar environment. So we only meet on writers' residencies, but it's a pleasure. And so because I remember then you were like, I'm going to go back to Afghanistan,
What
or
a foolish notion.
Yeah.
Should disabuse myself of. So I had a meeting with Radhika Jones, who had just taken over the mantle at Vanity Fair.
And had been an editor on the book review at the New York
Correct.
Times, right? Yeah.
She's another wonderful editor. She took a meeting with me and she asked me, what do you want to do now? And I told her, honestly, what I would so love to do is a celebrity profile.
Okay.
And I think it was coming from a place of I would like to do something dramatically different.
Yeah.
Just use a different part of my brain or what have you. And then she went away, and then a couple maybe weeks later, I receive a text, and it says, if we send you to China, can you find Fan Bingbing?
Okay.
And
did you know who Fan Bingbing was?
I vaguely could, only because I had been at a dinner just the night before where people were talking about her.
Okay.
And so then I look her up, and she is, yes, as you say, China's most famous celebrity who's gone missing. Like no one can find her. So like the hubris of like, what could I possibly contribute to this ongoing situation? And so then
this is when 2017.
2018.
Okay.
Yeah, over the summer. And I said, well, of course, absolutely.
Okay.
And then I frantically started doing this thing that you also know how to do, or you do often, which is I sort of concentric circled outwards. And so it was like, has anyone been to China? Yes or no? Does anyone speak Chinese? Like, oh, you have a cousin who has a roommate who dated someone who lived in, great, put me in touch. And I just kept doing that, and then eventually. And
it seemed because like you were like off the plane, and then suddenly at this party in like this director's spaceship-like house, right?
Yes, but that was. I mean, what's incredible is it confirmed for me the suspicion that I had already harbored, which is that everyone is like 5-6 degrees
of separation.
removed. Not even. I think once you get to a certain inner circle, it's like 4 or 5 circles. So, but eventually, if you talk to enough people. The beauty, I mean, this story seemed impossible to me in the beginning, but what I hadn't realized is that because she had been the reigning queen in the Chinese film world for so long, that if you found anyone who had worked in that industry
after her brutal adolescence, eating one bun a day.
Yes.
I like that detail.
Then like it was, everyone knew who she was.
Okay.
Yeah.
But then she turned up.
She did.
And did that so we again we'll put in the show notes, but so is it Fan Bingbing?
Fan Bingbing.
Fan Bingbing goes missing. You're assigned to China on a mission to find her, but she then turns up.
Yes.
What impact does that have?
Such
with
mixed
the story?
feelings.
before you had found her. Were you like, fan, you've let us all down?
Exactly. And then the game became but then she was still. I think she sent like one mea culpa text or tweet or whatever, and then was still sort of not talking to people. And so then the goal became trying to talk to her.
Okay. I mean, were like other reporters on the story? Was it like
all
a press
the people,
pack?
New York Times, CNN, everyone.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And did you like have a like magazine writer's slight aloofness about the daily stenographers who you weren't part of? Of course,
I would look down on them.
And how was it working in terms of like language and stuff? How long were you in China for that story?
I think I was there for December.
Like a month?
I remember, I spent Christmas there alone in a hotel room. And I remember, I became like fast friends with like everyone who worked at that hotel. And anyways, I mean, these are like meandering stories I don't need to tell here, but it was the thing I should also add though is that it was almost indecently fun for me. And
why? Because it wasn't like death and murder and destruction.
Yeah, and it really surprised me. I mean, I had no idea that reporting could be this fun if it doesn't involve worrying about being killed or interviewing people who have had terrible things happen to them.
Right. But would you want to do another celebrity profile?
Ooh, depending on whom. Maybe.
Only if they've vanished.
Yes, exactly. That is the key requirement. But I really enjoyed taking this like investigative approach to something seemingly silly, a celebrity profile.
I think that's a really interesting thing because like it's hard to do investigative journalism, right? And there aren't that a lot of people can't do it or don't do it. But it's like a set of skills that you can like apply to anything.
Absolutely, yeah. It was really fun. And I mean, I did a lot. I think I talked to 100 people.
Yeah.
I read like canonical.
All of whom claim to live next to her.
Correct. Exactly.
Yeah.
At least half.
3 doors down.
And I did a lot of like reading fiction, nonfiction. I mean, I was really starting from scratch. And there's
This is a film.
Really something like really exhilarating about going from a place of knowing nothing to a couple months later, very briefly, for like a fleeting second, being an expert in this tiny little thing.
Being the fan correspondent.
Yes, exactly.
I wanted to circle back to the whole finance piece. Essentially, it's come up a lot this week at the residency, as it always does. But, do you now make a living from your magazine writing? And is it a decent living?
Yes, and decent, that's a subjective term. I can pay rent and I don't know, pay for lunch.
Do you do any other work?
No, but I would like to. I really would like to.
Okay, what kind of thing?
I don't know. People always seem to have some side hustle, and I would really love to get one.
Okay.
But I don't have one. But what I should also come clean on is that I have a fellowship.
Okay.
I've always had one form or another, so that heavily subsidizes my.
But what is that? That pays for like travel, or how does it work?
Well, this year I have a fellowship that pays me a stipend every month.
Okay.
That covers rent and living.
This is the
expenses.
NYU thing, isn't it?
No, that was last year. This is I have a fellowship with the Lannan Foundation.
The what?
Lannan.
Okay.
Foundation.
Okay. And do you see that kind of thing where you're like on fellowships and stuff? Is that the way you want to continue it, or would you like a staff writing gig going forward?
I mean, I would love a real job if
if
one's on offer. Absolutely.
Okay. And can we talk now about fiction? I'm just thinking how much time. Yeah, we have 7 minutes.
Great.
So where you this week have been working on fiction, have you?
I was hoping to, but I got pulled into the dirty business that is journalism. But yeah, I would like to work on fiction.
And where does that? Is that a long-standing interest? Have you? I came clean about all my unpublished novels yesterday that I had tried to write. Had you been trying to do this for a long time?
No,
is it something new?
Not at all. No, I think I have certain impulses that are maybe more conducive to fiction writing.
Making stuff up.
Yeah, I mean all the time. Just kidding. I never make stuff up. Everything gets fact checked. No, just the desire to like write beautiful prose.
Okay.
And
do you think there's not latitude for that in nonfiction?
There is, and I think magazine writing is like a very happy place from which you can do that for sure.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I am one of those reporters who think fiction's a higher calling.
Yeah. No, I hear you.
And there's something so moving about like fiction work that nonfiction can't quite arrive at. I feel for me, like the times when I've had like transcendental experiences, it's often as a result of like a poem or a play or a short story, especially. Did
you feel? I mean, something people, nonfiction writers, sometimes say about trying to write fiction is like suddenly that the handrail is gone, right? You can't like call someone up to find out what happened, and that, while in some ways very liberating, is also quite frightening.
It's terrifying. And what I've realized is that people think, oh, they're both writing, it's the same. But actually, nonfiction work, you are two things. One is, I feel like I've arrived at a place finally where if I read my own draft, if I read it, and I can diagnose what the problem is, and I can introduce fixes.
Yeah.
But I feel like
with a magazine.
Magazine, yeah, very specifically. But with fiction, it either lands well or it doesn't, and I don't know how to fix it.
So are you trying to write a novel?
No, I'm working on short stories and a screenplay.
Okay, interesting. Because I think short stories, a reform experiencing a renaissance, right? In that, they were in the early 20th century, and then a period when they were absolute publishing death, and no one would publish them. And like, are you writing them because you think they're a good training ground?
No, I'm writing them because it's like it makes my soul happy.
Okay, that sounds valid.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned also, I don't know how much you can say about this, but your nonfiction book idea that you're cooking. How is that experience? I don't know if you can go into details of what that's about at this stage. How does that seem like a more natural extension of the magazine writing muscle in some ways?
I mean, the thing that people tell you is that it's a common misconception among magazine writers that
they can all write books.
That the book is like a longer magazine article, and it just isn't at all. And that's something that I try to remind myself. Just because I know how to write a magazine story doesn't mean that I'm going to like write 3 of them and then turn it into a book.
Yeah. And what is the kind of time frame for the book, do you think?
I mean, as soon as possible, always, right?
That's not an answer.
No, but I mean, I don't know. I haven't done it yet, so I have no idea how long these things take.
And on where you're going to be basing yourself in your life, you live in New York now. Do you think that you'll be remaining there for the foreseeable? Foreseeable,
another word that I don't quite know the answer to. Yeah, probably.
You won't be going off back to Kabul?
No. I mean, I do need to make a trip for an assignment, but I'm not planning on living there.
And does it feel, being both in New York, but maybe being in a kind of community of writers, is that important? Does that has that improved your quality of life?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think my dream state actually is being in a big fast villa like this, and then being alone, but knowing that there are people that I like just kind of scattered about on the grounds. That's my platonic ideal.
Well, let's maybe just we can. We'll talk about this more there, but having met you and I on a writer's residency and having reunited here, what do you think that residency environment that Gianni has so kindly welcomed us to here, what does that offer, apart from like great food?
I think solitude and community.
Right.
It's like the perfect combination. And I mean, this is a something that I've been theorizing. I try to figure out, why are these environments so wonderful?
Yeah.
And I think one crucial deep fact is that you're not wasting time trying to coordinate meetups with people, but like talking to another person is very important.
Sure.
Also for the work process.
Yeah.
And having these like de facto like 1 p.m. lunch, like 8 p.m. dinner.
We should explain that. Yeah, we declared that if you didn't come at the right time, you wouldn't be fed.
No food.
No food. Yeah.
And I think there's something really, really attractive to a modern person about submitting to these strict schedules. I'm so into them. Agencies completely overrated. I don't take them away from me. I don't want them.
It's been interesting that the modicum of choice we've provided has been like 3 options for food. It's led to chaos. I think there needs to be less choice. It is interesting. And I mean, I certainly that experience we had in America was amazing. And then when I came here and we spoke to Gianni, and Gianni was receptive, and I think I do think it's almost a kind of weirdly monastic, but
it's
not.
The best.
All right, I think we should end there before we gush anymore. But May, look, thanks for being such a great guest on the podcast, and wishing you all the very best with your various projects going forward.
Thank you for having me.
Hello, it's us again with an update from ourselves. Ellie, what have you been up to?
God, I was trying to think of what to say on the way here. It's so early in the morning. I haven't thought about my life yet.
We are doing this, at the brutal hour of
it's
10
not
to
that
9.
early, is it?
It's like almost 9 a.m. The horror.
Tonight, I'm going to the Mercury Awards.
Okay.
Which is
I do know what that is.
You do, okay, thank God. I thought I was explain that. Well, I'm excited to see Dave perform.
I don't know
who is the UK rapper of the moment, the UK Kendrick Lamar.
Okay.
He did that 7-minute rap about Question Time.
I thought you were the UK rapper of the moment, Ellie.
Only in the shower.
These musicians. You're wearing a very bling watch, I have to say.
Thank you to my boyfriend. Yes, it is, isn't it? It's because I'm thinking of my party attire later. Got my heels in my bag, watch on.
Okay.
Not yet made up. So yes, excited for that. What else have I been doing? Can't think. What about you?
I've been in Italy
Yes,
at this writers' retreat, which we talk about on the podcast with May, so you'll have heard more about that. It was really delightful, very beautiful. I've also been, I was working like a dog when I was there, turning around this magazine out of Outside, but they're seemingly happy with it, which is good.
What's
and also
it about?
The French Mountain Guides exam.
If I hear you talk about the French Alps one more time, you need to get off the Alps.
It's your country, Ellie.
That's true, it is, yeah.
And also dealing with the sort of continuing shenanigans with my book.
Did you read some out at the retreat? Isn't that the thing that you all read out?
We did a workshop every evening where people could do whatever. So some people read, other people just sort of talked. It was amazing.
Did you get any feedback?
I didn't read. I spoke mostly about this magazine piece that I was working on. So, but yeah, it was collegiate and friendly.
Oh, lots of nice wine and salami.
There was very good food. Although, I think, as I maybe said on air, like, we did spend about 3 hours a day eating.
Quite right.
Which sort of impinged slightly on working time, but that was fine. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb.
Me, Eleanor Halls.
Our producer is Nicola Keane. Our score is by Jess Danheiser. Our graphic design is by James Edgar.
And if you'd like to find us on social media, it's Always Take Notes on Instagram and Take Notes Always on Twitter. Please do, as always, leave a review on iTunes, where you can also subscribe.
And if you fancy supporting our crowdfunding page, that's on Patreon at Always Take Notes. Many thanks.
Bye.